Welcome to the February 21st work session, and the beginning of this is an executive session. Eugene's, oh, there we go, there's the rest of the crowd. The Eugene City Council will now meet in executive session held pursuant to ORS 192.6602H to consult with counsel concerning legal rights and duties regarding current litigation or litigation that may be filed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience, of which there are none, are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. At the end of the executive session, we will return to open session and welcome the audience back into the room. And now I turn it over to you.
so I'm trying to formulate a better question here. My initial question was going to be, what ordinance could you craft not already covered by state law that would still stay on the safe side of not being an affront to the current executive order?
I think, Mike, that the main thing that is not in the state law that, if you wanted to do it separately, could be in the city code is what's in the city manager's administrative order. So the state law simply says, or is limited to law enforcement agencies. What John did in his administrative order was to say, those same protections, we're not going to go collect information or detain somebody based on immigration status. That's in the administrative order. You could decide you wanted that to be in an ordinance. Or a resolution.
I guess I will want to have the chief, I will want to have the police chief at a conversation of this, because there's some specific information that I'm going to want. It sounds like someone's banging the gavel there. Hello?
Nobody's banging.
Oh, okay, all right. The information that I'm going to look for is regular police procedure. I know that it's when the sheriff, for example, books someone into the jail, that information is put into the LED, and ICE monitors LED. And so that is, I'll want to know if he considers that regular handoff the collection of information, or what they do procedurally when they hand off to the jail.
We can try to find that out. I can tell you, Mike, that the state law that we're talking about has an exception that says a law enforcement agency may exchange information, including with the feds, in order to verify the immigration status of a person if the person is arrested for any criminal offense. So what the state law is really focused on is we're not going to be out there affirmatively looking for people who are here illegally. If their only crime is that they are violating the immigration laws, we're not going to go out there to try to detect them. We're not going to apprehend them. But if we're arresting somebody for another crime, there's nothing in state law that then says, oh, well, you can't have certain information.
What I'm looking for is how what we may do will impact regular police procedure and behavior. And there's one other piece of that too, and it's that the state law, the 181-820, delineates very clearly about the ICE authority to make what are civil arrests, essentially, and the difference between that and an existing warrant. So I'm going to have a question of the chief that if there is an immigration warrant from a court that exists, and that's the only reason that they are detaining someone, will they in fact will our discussions prohibit them from executing lawfully issued warrants that are solely for immigration?
Unless the direction you give us is to create an ordinance that is different than the state law provision, the answer to your question is it would not affect current police procedure, because my understanding of the ad hoc committee's recommendation is to take the state law as it exists and put it into city code, but then expand it so that it also includes other city and
so forth that delineate the exception for warrants. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that's what is also in the manager's administrative order, is we just said what's in state law applies here, and it applies to others. So those exceptions are also there.
Okay. Thanks, Glenn.
So the semantics game seems like that if I were advising the Trump administration, I would just write says anybody that says there are sanctuary
specifically to federal reimbursement, some of it is predicated on judicial review. That if we were to do something, they were to do something, sue in court, we'll get an opportunity to have the situation mitigated. One of the questions I've read about recently is on issues around immigration, whether or not the court actually has standing for judicial review, and that's rather than challenge that directly, the administration decided to reissue the order. So here's my question. If I suppose I would ask, if any of your advice is predicated on judicial review, would you be sure to please tell us if you think that it's possible that the court could decide that an executive order isn't subject to judicial review?
I think I can answer your question. It doesn't depend on the executive order, because it's not the executive order that would take away our funding. It's a specific agency saying we're no longer going to provide you that funding. And on that, I am very confident that the courts are going to say, we get to review that. It may be a court, and of course, so far the Ninth Circuit has said, yes, they do get to review the executive orders. But even if ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you don't, that wouldn't change our legal conclusions on this, because this isn't about the executive order. This is about a specific federal agency terminating our funding, and there the Federal Administrative Procedures Act does grant us the ability to have that reviewed. And what we discovered in that litigation that I did 20-some-odd years ago is that when the judge heard about the federal government trying to basically extort, coerce a consent decree out of the state, the judge didn't think that was appropriate. To put it mildly, I think most judges would find something similar here if the federal government tried to pull our funding for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with that program, that the federal government would have a very hard sell to win that case.
Well, I agree with you in what you're saying. I guess the point I was getting to as well is that when it comes to predicting behavior and advising us on this, it's my experience, and just from observation, that this administration isn't really subject to backing down so much as doubling down in a potential conflict. So I would want us to consider that, I suppose.
And Mike, I absolutely agree with that, which is why earlier I said, just because I think we win the litigation doesn't mean that there won't be an impact on the city, because it could be funding is pulled and it's several years before the litigation is over. There's always the possibility we don't get grants that we otherwise would have, and it's very difficult to get a court
Executive session is now closed.
And then you wait until they knock on the
And,
window.
Secret handshake.
and secret handshake. Okay, we're here.
So now you resume the regular session.
All right, now we are resuming the regular work session, and I will turn this over to City Manager.
Thanks, Mayor. And I think what we can do, given the time, I think it would be helpful if Stephanie gave her presentation, at least on this. You may not end up having your full discussion yet. We could come back to ensure that we have enough time for that. And then Alan's intended motion, maybe that does make sense to do that after the public hearings at 7:30. So at least, Stephanie, why don't you make your presentation and get as far as we can and then come back for a second round.
Perfect. Thank you, and sorry to keep you waiting.
No worries. Good evening, Mayor and Council. And so I have copies of the PowerPoint presentation. And so let me pass those out to everybody. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So here's the rest of them. Okay. And so this work session was in response to a poll that was initiated by Councilor Claire Siret. And so what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try to just take about 10 minutes because I want to leave a lot of time for you all to provide your thoughts and direction and guidance to us so that we can further explore the issues that you all are interested in. But really the intent of this was to better understand Eugene's overall housing market conditions for renters, talk a little bit about Eugene's existing programs, and then to try to get to, well, what are some potential directions for the future? And so that's the way that I've structured the presentation that we can run through fairly quickly. So just as a reminder, we will have a separate work session on the specific topic of inclusionary zoning and construction excise tax. So I'm really not going to be talking about that program in any specificity right now. So when we think about who rents and why, we know that overall, oh yeah, thank you very much. So when we think about who rents and why, we know that in our country, there overall has been a steady growth in the number of households that rent, and we've also experienced this trend here locally. Nationally, 37% of households rent compared with 31% in 2005, and that renting has increased across all age groups, households, and income types, and actually people that are kind of in the prime of their lives are where you're seeing some of the greatest growth in rentals, in renter households. And there have been a lot of impacts from the recession. The recession suppressed household formation, but it also increased demand as people moved from homeownership to rentals as a result of the foreclosure crisis. When we look at Eugene's housing market, Eugene has become a majority renter household community, with 53% of households renting at this point in time, according to census data. This has increased from 48% in 2000. And so, like many urban communities, we do have a higher percentage of rentals, and also goes along with being a college town to some extent. We can look at median rents. We've definitely seen increases for all unit types. And vacancy rates have remained consistently fairly low. We have seen a number of rental units increase steadily over the past several years to over 18,000 units, which are now registered through the Rental Housing Code program. And we have over 3,500 subsidized affordable housing units in Eugene, and those have fairly extensive wait lists. While we continue to develop affordable rental housing, this production has slowed somewhat due to declining resources and increased competition for those resources. So just taking a look at our rental units by structure type, oftentimes when people think of rental units, they think of them in multifamily buildings, but actually in our community, almost 50% of our rental units are in single-family homes, and another 26% are in two-unit developments, and then the remainder are in multifamily, and a very small percentage are manufactured home units. This is just examples of the wide variety of affordable subsidized rental housing that we've developed in our community. These are all projects that have been completed in the past 5 years. So I wanted to try to break down the issues of housing need into different categories. And in economic terms, housing is a very complex good. It comes in lots of shapes and sizes, and there's lots of differences in what people need and want. But generally, you can think of it in terms of affordability, availability, access, quality, and stability. And I'll run through the market conditions for each of these factors briefly and talk about the corresponding city programs that relate to each of these issue areas. So when we look at the market conditions for rental housing affordability, we know that a majority of Eugene renters have what's called a housing cost burden. This means they pay more than 30% of their income for rent plus utilities. When you look specifically at low-income renters, that percentage rises to 76%, and 50% of those renters have what's called a severe housing cost burden, which means they're paying more than half of their income for their rent and utilities. In essence, we have too many low-income households that are competing for a limited supply of affordable market rate units and also affordable subsidized units in our market. And when we look at our related goals and policies that have been adopted by council, they're really in two different places. So one is in the Eugene Springfield Consolidated Plan, which directs the use of our federal funds that we receive. And council adopted a goal in 2015 to increase the supply of affordable housing units. And then secondly, it appears in the Envision Eugene pillars, which establishes a goal of providing affordable housing for all income levels. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about rental housing availability. And so affordability issues, really, most significant challenges among people with limited income. But when you begin to look at rental housing availability, we're starting to see more challenges with people with moderate income. So they would normally be able to afford units in our market, but the challenges they're having is finding them and finding them in the right places and the right configuration, for their family type and particular needs. And we also see that there's still a mismatch between what the market can produce and what people can pay, even when you get to a moderate income level. And I would lastly identify that we do have an increase in the number of high-income renters in our community. So typically, you often see sort of the newest units are the highest rents, they're for the highest income renters, and then slightly older units become available for moderate income. Because we're seeing this growth in high-income renters, you're not really seeing that shift in the market that makes more units available to moderate income renters. As we look at our related goals and policies, this is really, relates most directly to Envision Eugene, which has the goal of increasing the overall supply of housing units. And then this is also where MUPTI comes in, the multi-unit property tax exemption program, which is also trying to encourage high-quality multi-unit downtown housing. Access, issues of access really vary dramatically within the market depending upon the characteristics of the person that is seeking housing. Both local and national research shows that your access to rental housing is impacted by your race, national origin, familial status, disability, source of income, and other characteristics. We also know that the rental housing application process can create some barriers for people depending upon their specific challenges. And we've heard concerns related to application fees, deposits, and other leasing practices. The related goals and policies that we currently have in place in the consolidated plan, we do have a goal of removing barriers to affordable and supportive housing, and we provide fair housing services, training, and education to that end. And then secondly, City of Eugene has established a housing discrimination and complaint system in our own local code, which is part of our commitment to human rights. Rental housing quality is a topic that you all have spent a lot of time on recently. So I'll just skim over this, but just overall, almost 2/3 of Eugene's housing stock was built prior to 1980. So this is really kind of a place where you begin to see a lot of major systems deterioration and need for improvements to that stock. And generally, lower priced rental units available on the market tend to be older and in poorer condition. When we look at Oregon tenant landlord law, it does set habitability standards, but you must go to small claims court to seek damages. Council recently extended the Eugene Rental Housing Code to set habitability standards. And then in addition to that, we proactively try to address rehabilitation needs in affordable housing through the Eugene Springfield Consolidated Plan. The fifth area that I'm going to touch upon is rental housing stability. In the market, we have seen a number of concerns emerge from renters regarding notifications, rent increases, lease terminations, and no-cause evictions. The prominence of these issues across the state have led to recent legislation on notices of rent increases that took place in the last legislative session. In this legislative session that's underway, there are multiple housing bills that have been introduced to address no-cause evictions and to try to increase renter stability. We are tracking these issues through the IGR processes. And locally, we do have a condominium and manufactured home park closure ordinance that was adopted by council in 2008. And these two codes set standards for notification, first right of refusal, and relocation costs when rental units are converted to condominiums or when a manufactured home park is closed. So I wanted to try to leave a lot of time to talk about next steps. There's an enormous array of possible housing interventions. And so rather than trying to identify all the different programs and potential options, we thought it would be helpful for council to provide guidance on the outcomes that you would like to see. What are the issues that you're most concerned about? What questions do you have? We've also recognized that there's definitely a need to conduct some additional market research on the conditions because a lot of what we have is fairly high level. And what we'd like to do is, with your guidance, conduct some additional research, identify options for expanding existing programs or adopting new programs and policies. And we would also work with the Housing Policy Board to flesh out those options and then come back to council at a later date with that analysis and policy options for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. That was a lot of material in a short amount of time. Quite a performance. George, you're up first.
Yeah, I just have one real quick question. A lot of percentages were thrown at us at the very start. Do those percentages include primarily the 53% of Eugene households now rent their homes? Does that percentage include all the student housing that has been?
It includes all off-campus student housing.
That's what I meant.
Yes, that's correct.
If we were to remove that from that equation, what would that percentage be then at that point?
I don't know.
Would it be difficult to figure that out somehow?
Well, I guess part of it is, are you trying to remove all students from that equation? Or because we know that students rent a variety of different housing types.
No, I think it would be impossible to remove all students. What I'm looking at primarily, how it would change that percentage if we took primarily the buildings that are kind of identified as student housing or students that, and particularly the ones that we've recently had built in our community. I just want to get a better read on what a more true percentage of rental versus home ownership is without the student housing in that equation, the off-campus student housing in that equation.
You know, I don't know, but I think even just looking at the division of the rental unit types, you know, you still see that almost half of the rental housing stock is in single-family homes, and so I think it still would be fairly significant. But it's not, I mean, these percentages are not that far out of line with other communities that have large student populations. And when you look at urban areas, you know, you definitely see higher rental rates than you do in suburban or rural communities. So when you compare that to the national average, keep that in mind.
Okay. Well, if there is some way to do that, I'd appreciate the.
I just want to make sure I understand. So what, are you trying to kind of get a sense of, if we did not have the university here, what would be the split between rental and home ownership?
Right.
Okay, so.
And I realize that there's a lot of houses out there that
Right.
are currently rented to students, and that may be a little difficult. But as best estimated number that we can get as to rental versus ownership without student housing, off-campus student housing.
So for example, Stephanie, you may know, I think I've seen maps from the university in which they say, you know, we have X number of students who live off campus, and they have a sense of where they live in the community. I think there's something like that. So there may be some aggregate number that gets at that, recognizing its magnitudes of percentages plus or minus. So there may be ways of getting that amount of data. We can take a look at that.
We can look into that.
Claire?
Thank you. So thank you, Stephanie, for the presentation. So I sponsored this work session poll partly in response to folks in Whitaker who were concerned that if we implement a quiet zone for the train, that property values will rise in that neighborhood to the point where folks will be displaced who are currently able to afford living there. And obviously, any action we take would apply to the whole city and hopefully benefit folks in other parts of the community as well. So for me, the goal is to look at how we can have residents experience stable housing situations and reduce the impacts of market forces that can lead to homelessness or unstable housing situations. I think we all can recognize that people without stable housing can't contribute to their own economic and social success, which also impacts the city's overall economic success. And when you have a really low vacancy rate, such as we have here, that means renters are very vulnerable and basically at the mercy of the market and don't have a lot of options if rents are raised on them. So just as we have economic development programs to support new and current local businesses, I believe we have an obligation to find ways we can support people staying in affordable units, non-subsidized affordable units, whether that's through programs that get at the rental market or, you know, in other cases we talk about potentially raising the minimum wage and those kinds of things to help folks have more income. When folks are paying more than 50% of their income on housing, they don't have money to spend on other things that help drive our local economy, like restaurants, retail stores, and cultural events. So we do a lot in terms of supporting the building of subsidized housing, and I'm proud of the work we do there. So I really want us to explore things that we can do as a city to stabilize renters in market rate housing. So that was my intention with this work session. So I would really like us to develop a list of potential actions we could take to do this. And I recognize there's activity at the state legislature that may get at some of these things that I'm seeking, such as a 90-day no-cause eviction notice, potentially a low or no interest rate loans to property owners to refurbish older housing stock while keeping their rents affordable, and potentially grandfathering in current renters when a property is sold in terms of raising rates on current renters or changing the rules under which they can live in those properties. So those are some of the things that I'm really interested in finding out more about.
Chris?
Can I get in the queue, Mayor, please?
Yes.
Thank you. I realize we're just touching on what is really a lot of information, and one of the important elements for me in terms of bringing this topic up, and I'm glad that Claire did, is what are the emergent issues that are coming up. A lot of what drove this was some real significant renter housing issues that arose in Portland, and were there was going to be problems here? What had the legislation in Salem covered, and what might be the gaps? Areas that were left unprotected, and should there be an emergent problem in Eugene, could we get ahead of the curve, or could we do something proactive? So I think that, for me, was a lot of what was my impetus here. And I think going into greater detail on protections already in place versus protections that aren't, that we might need to consider if there is an issue in a particular area. And I think the Housing Policy Board is trying to study what those emergent issues might be, and trying to figure out if there's a way to get ahead of them, or if there even is a problem. Interestingly, and this is, I'm really intrigued with what George was talking about in terms of student housing. I think it raises a really important question that we need to kind of wrap our heads around. It has an Envision Eugene impact as well as a housing impact, which is what is the profile of people in Eugene? What constitutes the profile of people in Eugene? Are there certain people who are considered the residents of Eugene, and then people who they live here but they're not the residents? What status do students have as part of the profile of Eugene? Because I hear a lot of us talk about, well, what's the rental market in Eugene look like if you take the students out? I'm going, well, why would you take the students out? That's part of the profile of Eugene. There's 20,000 of them here, and they're not going to disappear tomorrow. They may matriculate every 4 years, but a new set comes in. And so there's always 20,000 students here. So to me, recognizing that there is a certain impact of 20,000 students every single year in the city of Eugene is part of the housing mix here. And so it just raises a question that if we look at the mix of owner versus rental, and suddenly say, well, I want to take all the students out to get an accurate picture of what the mix is, to me that's not an accurate picture, because those 20,000 kids are here all the time. And so I'm thinking we need to figure out what that mix is. How does that mix work, and what does that mix represent for us? And I think that is a good conversation to have, because I think we've danced around the idea of what do students represent as part of the population and mix of Eugene. And I would like for us to explore exactly what do students represent in terms of being in or out or part of or a element in the population of Eugene. And to me, that's an Envision Eugene question as much as anything else.
Mike? Mike, can you hear? Well,
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, my trying to get the mute button off there. I appreciate Claire bringing up this subject for a work session. I'm one of the people she described. And as someone who rents and someone who does so under some of those conditions, I'm uniquely aware of the circumstances she described, and understand the importance of doing something about it in a very personal way. But I would say that my focus on the best solution to such issues would be centered around consideration of an MIT study that was done 2 years ago that said that the number one corollary predictor of income inequality was home ownership. And as a result, our community, as we've just heard, even though we have a university, but many communities have universities and have students, disproportionate to the national average, we're, what was it, almost 20 points? It was like 33 to 53, wasn't that what I heard? Something like that? So we're a very disproportionate to the country's average of ownership versus rental. And I would think if the city were going to be making efforts to try and create a more stable community and less income inequality, the smartest thing we could be doing by all those who studied it is to do more to encourage more home ownership. And I would wonder what the staff would suggest in that case.
So I can.
Thank you.
I can respond just a little bit, and it's definitely an issue that we can look into more. And I've spent my whole career looking at issues of housing markets and the interplay of housing markets. And there's a very interesting interplay between rental and owner housing markets, especially when so much of our rental housing stock is composed of single family units. And so I think, with some more research, we might actually be able to see how recent larger rental development has impacted the single family rental market, because we know that prices have been increasing and that a lot of people who would like to be in homeownership situations have had difficulty finding units in the community. So I think there's definitely more than one way to address a need for both rental units and homeownership units. I would also say having a stable rental and that is affordable to you actually positions people to be able to save for homeownership and to be able to accumulate the money and stability necessary to move into stable homeownership. So I tend to kind of think of these things as a progression. And definitely agree that you want to create those opportunities for homeownership as well as rental housing. But there are a lot of relationships between those two areas.
Right. Well, and I appreciate that very much. I agree with you. What I was suggesting was if the city is going to spend money or make efforts to try and get at the core issue, which was folks without resources to live well, essentially, that perhaps we should be spending equal amounts of money or equal creative energy to try and come up with ways where we can assist more people to be buying homes rather than renting them. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah, I just want to follow on Mike's comment and on Claire's, which is that there is the supply question, and the supply of that missing middle housing, which is, the housing that could be that transitional housing that could either be rental or condo or some co-op or whatever. There are various models. And so I'm very interested in the kind of incentives and programs that we can have that would help us, expand that level of housing, because we can protect people, we can remove some barriers in terms of income and rent stability, but at the end of the day, we actually need more housing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just interested in the role that the city might be able to play. And
with respect to
policies
that
support
homeownership.
Right. Well, no, maybe, or the construction of that housing, or the remodeling of housing, or the reclaiming of housing, or the changing our zoning around duplexes, or, some of those vehicles that we have just to have more of that sort of smaller size housing that people can afford, that you can build in infill development, for instance. It's not a huge apartment building, fits into the landscape of a neighborhood, but provides more housing.
That could be rental or homeownership.
Could be rental or homeownership.
Great.
Yeah, Alan, and then Greg.
Yeah, I have the same interest. I'm very interested in finding ways to incentivize the development or construction of workforce housing or middle housing that, just above affordable housing. Affordable housing is the subsidized low-income housing. And then there's a giant gap to market housing, and that stuff in the middle is just missing in Eugene. And I like to see us look at ways to incentivize the development or the construction of that kind of housing, whether it be through policies or incentives or SDC waivers, or however we might do that so that we can stimulate the development of that. My understanding is that it was, at one point, it was the only thing you could build in Eugene for a while in the recession was student housing, because the only thing you can get a loan for. And then we have lots of single-family housing on the higher end, which is very profitable. But so the stuff in the middle hasn't been developed because it's just been not as profitable, and financing hasn't been available. So figuring out how to do that, maybe even a community bank to create a pool of money that can be funded just helps create some of those things. Another thing I was interested in is, and I was going to put a work session out on this, which is kind of the idea of exploring a residential MUPD. And the idea would be that we'd do property tax for residential improvements to your house, where we would freeze the assessed value for X number of years, maybe depending on how much you do or whatever, if someone invests in their property, in their residential property. So it'd be sort of what we do with MUPD, but for residential folks. So I'd like to see how that might. Yeah, SUPD. Single. Yeah, it's not necessarily single family, but I do like the loan pool idea for improvements as well as a different way to look at it. I'm also interested in notice requirements and how that plays out here, and whether or not we need to do something in there. The other thing I am interested in is if we could get a list of the bills that are in the legislature that are currently alive that are related to this issue, that would be very helpful so we can see what's going on. And as they come up or get passed or rejected, we keep status of that while the legislature's in session. And then finally on the students part, I guess I represent a lot of the students in my ward. I look at them as part of our city. They're citizens. They're a permanent fixture, part of our housing mix. We're permanent renters, so I don't see why we would take them out of the picture. It doesn't make sense to me that we would do that, because they're there. And I don't know. I can't imagine what a policy would look like that didn't have to do with student housing. I was very much in favor of taking student housing out of the MUPD, because we didn't need to incentivize development of that. But as far as protections for renters, I think the rental housing code and the things that we might do that advance that or go on top of that, expand those protections, apply to students as much as they do to everybody else that's in the city.
Mayor, can I jump in the queue?
Okay, but it is 2 minutes to 7. And so we will need to extend this meeting if we want 2 more speakers.
Move to extend 10 minutes.
Move to extend 10 minutes. Do you have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, great. We will extend for 10 minutes. Greg, and then Emily, and then Mike.
Stephanie, one of the things that has continually bothered me in this whole dialogue and discussion is the quality of existing rentals, specifically our older housing stock, which is scattered throughout the city, that's continuing to deteriorate because the people who own those houses don't have the resources to invest in upgrading and maintaining their homes or the rentals that they, own to, rent out to other people. And that's particularly true in my ward, and I know that there are pockets all over the city that are in similar condition to that. Are there ways or tools before they disappear at the federal level to be able to incentivize along the same lines as what Alan was talking about, the redevelopment of and the improvement of the housing quality that currently exists. And I will add a little caveat to Councilor Pryor's comment about the number of students we have in student housing. It's more like 35,000 when you include the community college.
Good point.
So, and that's kind of a mix between, people who are part-time students as well as full-time students and all of that. So it's really not as cut and dry as there are students and then there are non-students, but there's a lot of people all along that continuum of transition between, back and forth and in and out of things. So just keep that in mind. But how do we improve or incentivize the improvement of existing housing stock that usually is in that more affordable housing category, or should be, but now nothing's affordable around here? Nothing. I mean, it's really tough.
We can definitely look into and bring back some policy options for the market rate housing. And, I would say that by and large, the federal funds that we receive, the agencies that use them the most are nonprofit agencies because they're really capable of dealing with all of the requirements that go along with those funding sources. And so we don't really have tools at this point that don't involve federal funds, except for the in-kind tax exemptions and SDC waivers that the city provides. But there are a variety of different strategies that cities across the country, there are a lot of cities that have much older housing stock than Eugene that have decided to undertake fairly substantial rehabilitation programs to try to bring their housing up to speed. And I think as Eugene ages, it's something that we really haven't had to deal with before, but we're now at that place where we should consider those options too.
Emily?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Stephanie. I think it's really critical to protect our renters right now with the low housing stock. I'm not sure if this is one of the things they're working on in Salem, but if not, I would really like us to have a 90-day no-cause eviction. That's really, really hurting people. I have a friend who's lived someplace 25 years. She got 30 days to get out. And it's something we've heard a lot about lately. Also, the drastic rent increases. I don't know what options are for rent control, but possibly there's a way to limit the percentage at once that you can raise it, because it's shocking what happens. I would, of course, like to see incentivizing, whatever the word is, helping the middle income, the low income housing. We desperately need more. I do wonder about the tax exemptions for improvements. I think it's great. I'd love to see it for building houses besides multi-units. But I do wonder about the people who will have just made improvements and missed that tax exemption. I'd be really, really irritated.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to take a moment to say something that I don't get to say very often, and I wish I could. I think Alan is exactly right. I think that's a fantastic idea. I'd be happy to work on it with you. It's one that I raised.
Mike, could you repeat that?
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I'm sure this is being recorded too, which is wonderful. No, I first raised that idea 8 years ago after Representative Bruce Hanna brought that up in the state legislature in the 2007 session as an idea that didn't pass at the state legislative level. But I have always thought that's a great idea, and I'd be happy to work on it with you.
Cool. That sounds great. Chris?
Yeah, in fact, to carry on the tradition of agreeing with something that Mike said earlier, I do think that home ownership is an enormous stabilizing element. I do think that is very true. And one thing that we've been kind of toying around with, or at least I've been toying around with, is the notion of how to create more ownership opportunities at a more affordable price range. You could think of it as, what is ownership below 1,500? And by that I mean constructing homes that are of lower square footage. It could be anywhere from 200 square feet all the way up to 1,500 square feet. It's much more affordable. People can, it's workforce housing. People can live there. You can put it in a variety of places. If you're wanting to talk about infill, you have a lot more opportunities for infill at 200, 300, 400 square feet than trying to figure out how to place a bunch of, 2,000 square foot, 2,400 square foot single family homes that are very expensive. So figuring out a way to encourage home ownership in a way that is affordable and is able to be managed and can fit in, I think is a real good opportunity we should look at. So anyway, I would think if we could explore that fills in that middle gap in terms of the kind of housing people can afford and can live in.
Betty?
Okay, now we're approaching a discussion of inclusionary zoning when you say things like that. And that's exactly what inclusionary zoning would do if we have to have less expensive, a certain percentage of less expensive units in any development. Thank you.
Right, thanks. John?
What I was going to suggest, based on this conversation, which has been a great conversation, is with these next steps, we can try to put together some desired outcomes based on what we've heard here, and then we can conduct this additional research, and then we'll bring that back to you before we start moving into options, so you're comfortable with the outcomes and then with what the research is, and then we can start bringing back options for policy recommendations at that time, if that works for you. So we bring back additional information in another work session here. That would be helpful.
Alan?
Just before we adjourn, I just wanted to let folks know that I'm, because of the holiday, I have to run to a neighborhood meeting, but I'll be back I'll probably miss the first part of the public hearing.
Okay. All right, I think that brings us to a close. Thank you very much, and see you in just 20 minutes.